suppose the first thing that comes to my mind also would be courage and strength. We're talking about Swami Vivekananda because of the proximity of his birthday. His Tithi Puja, traditionally calculated birthday was yesterday, the 10th. His solar birthday, say actually born on a certain day, would have been Monday, that is tomorrow, the 12th of January. So first of all, we have to understand the monastic name, Vivekananda, the one who has the bliss of discernment. That must be characteristic of the person. And we also have to say that there's another contribution, by the way, it's focus and coherence as well as determination, yes. All of these. It was very difficult to describe such a polymath, such a multi-talented person. And it is true to say that without Swami Vivekananda's appearance in the Parliament of Religions in 1893, and I point this out at many, many yoga gatherings, we would know nothing about the subjects of Eastern philosophy, yoga, and so on and so forth, if it wasn't for Swami Vivekananda. We would have known a lot about Buddhism. Buddhism was already well known. A famous book, Light of Asia, was there, and he constantly referred to it. So a couple of things occur to me, but one thing is his extreme intelligence, even as a boy. And I'm referring to a kind of biography here. So he says, at college, Narendranath, that's his name, began to interest himself more seriously in studies. Apart from the usual college curriculum, he avidly studied Western logic, the abstruse philosophy of Herbert Spencer, the systems of Kant and Schopenhauer, the mystical and analytical speculations of the Aristotelian school, the positivist philosophy of Comte and John Stuart Mill's 3 essays on religion. He also mastered the ancient and modern history of Europe and the English poets like Shelley and Wordsworth, and he even took a course in physiology with a view to understanding the functioning of the nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord. Imagine such a multi-talented person. And this, of course, would have evoked a reaction because even, when he was very young, 8 years old, 9 years old, he was impressing his tutors. He was gifted with a multiplicity of talents, and he cultivated them all. His leonine beauty was matched by his courage. Courage was mentioned. He had the build of an athlete, a delightful voice, a brilliant intellect. His interests ranged from fencing, wrestling, rowing games, physical exercise, cooking, and organizing dramas to instrumental and vocal music. Love of philosophical discussion and criticism. And in all of these, he was an undisputed leader. These and other traits in his character soon attracted the notice of his teachers and also his fellow students. And the principal of his college, Professor Hastie, once remarked, "Narendra is a real genius. I have traveled far and wide, but have not yet come across a lad of his talents and possibilities, even among the philosophical students in the German universities. He is bound to make his mark in life." Now, if you see all the adventures in his childhood, he was a very adventurous young boy, but he also wanted to test out various statements. For example, his father dealt with people of many, many different backgrounds and religions, and he had a whole range of pipes, smoking pipes, that you traditionally offer, as a guest or to a guest. And why do you have such a range of pipes? Can't they all smoke the one thing? No. If they do, you'll lose your caste. So he crept into the room where these impressive pipes were and tested each one out. And his father caught him, "What are you doing?" He said, "I am seeing what it looks like to lose your caste." So he had a skeptical nature, testing nature, adventurous nature. There's a very wonderful portrait, I suppose, of him as a youth that creates a foundation for his impact in life. And Sri Ramakrishna would have noticed it straight away, not only noticed it, but would have had a precognitive understanding of the value of Narayan, because he had a vision, of course, of Narayan as a sage. And he, as a young boy, tugging at him, one of the seven sages, come with me, come down. Now, it's kind of part of the theology of avatars or incarnations, the word, the logos, becoming flesh and dwelling amongst us, that he would come with his companions. And so there were what we call Ishwara Kotis, those who are eternally perfect, that come with the incarnation. And Vivekananda was clearly one of these. But you see, in studying all these philosophical things, he came into conflict because his mother was very, very religious, taught him the Ramayana, Mahabharata, all the stories that you learn in your youth, and he believed them all and was dedicated to all of them. But this Western kind of influence made him think. And so the constant contact with Western thought, says the biography, which lays particularly emphasis on the supremacy of reason, brought about a severe conflict in Narendranath. And his inborn tendency towards spirituality and his respect for the ancient traditions and beliefs of his religion, which had imbibed from his mother, on the one side, and his argumentative nature coupled with his sharp intellect, which hated superstition and questioned simple faith, on the other. They were now at war with each other. Even when he was very small, he went to sleep and immediately saw a light in the forehead there, which expanded and embraced him whole. So he had personal experience of spirituality even in his extreme youth. So under a deep spiritual urge, he was then found observing hard ascetic practices. Don't think that his spiritual practices began later. No. He was testing out his faith versus his reason, something that we know about today, because in the Western Hemisphere, that is the big discussion, faith versus reason. Can one be reasonable and still have your religious conviction? And of course, in many of his lectures, we see his answer to it. He gives a lecture, for example, way back now in 1896, 12th November. And his style of delivering a speech, a lecture, is extremely engaging, extremely interesting. If you want to be a good orator, then you start off with an unusual perspective, an interesting perspective. If you start off putting people to sleep, then by the end of your so-called lecture, there will be extreme sounds of snoring in the audience. But this was delivered in London, and he begins like this. I will relate to you a very ancient story from the Chandogya Upanishad, which tells how knowledge came to a boy. That's how he begins. Begins as a kind of story. Even in his second lecture, The Parliament of Religions, he starts why we disagree. His whole lecture is just a simple story that he learned from Ramakrishna about the frog in the well. Now he starts off like that, and as he goes on, he's relating various stories from the Chandogya Upanishad. Because in the Chandogya Upanishad, there are a number of stories there which can easily be picked up and studied. We often think the Upanishad is very hard to study, but there it is. He picks it up immediately in the story form, teaching the Upanishads. And remarkably, he's not quoting Sanskrit. Many of our speakers today think that they have to quote the Sanskrit passage, then the translation, and then the commentary and all the rest of it. Swami Vivekananda doesn't seem to have done that because he's talking to Western people. And so his message is universal. And again, what we're saying is the theme of this discussion is on the universality of Vivekananda's universal message. Is it something for everyone? And the great, impressive personalities, spiritual personalities of various ages, will adapt their message to suit the audience. They won't impose something foreign. So what is foreign about Vedanta? Well, the name is foreign, no doubt. But the explanation is very, very universal and easy. The end of all religions, he says, is the realizing of God in the soul. That's for everybody. He says, that is one universal religion. If there is one universal truth in all religions, I will place it here in realizing God. In other words, religion is defined as realization of the highest, deepest principle in you. Not something external, not something extraneous. He says ideals and methods may differ, but that is the central point. There is that beyond all books, beyond all creeds, beyond the vanities of this world, and it's the realization of God within yourself. When Swami Vivekananda got back to India, he was asked by a fellow disciple of Ramakrishna, hey, how is it that you never taught Ramakrishna in Western countries? And he replied something like this, well, if I had taught about Ramakrishna, the incarnation, etc., they would have said, well, we have Jesus Christ and there's the end of it. So, is there somebody who you can think of that embodies these highest, noblest principles of Vedanta? Yes. Then you can point to a 19th century mystic, what do you call a Paramahansa called Ramakrishna, who happens to be my master, that kind of thing, he could have said. In other words, if you're inspired by that personality, that is fine, but there's no sectarianism about it. There's no religion about it in the traditional sense that some people think of religion. The word religion has two possible origins. One is religio and one is religere. Religio means, following a certain set of restrictive rules and conditions. And we could say, well, doctrine and dogma, systems and so on could come under that. But religere is to reread, in other words, to study what is deeply inside the message of these great teachers. That is why there's a systematic process about it. You pick up any book that is inspiring or you feel is inspired. We often call this scripture, and every religion has its own book, its own scripture. And Vivekananda very, very acutely and astutely says, one thing you can notice about the main religions today surviving, they all have a book. What does that mean? Well, it means that there is a record of somebody who says, I have seen God, I have seen the soul, I have experienced the highest, the noblest, the deepest. And of course, you can also do it, but you have to follow the method. So in other words, it's following a scientific process that says, we have learned from people who have made the experimentation or have knowledge of a principle. They declare it, and how do we validate it? How do we make them respectable, validated teachers? How can we trust their teachings? How can we give them authority? Even Jesus was said, you teach as one with authority. And indeed, one of Swami Vivekananda's close Western disciples, Josephine McLeod, she says, life was revolutionized, this is the background to what she's saying, by her meeting with Swami Vivekananda, during the early part of 1895 in New York. She remarked that when she heard Swamiji speak, she says this, instantly, to me, that was truth. And the second sentence he spoke was truth. And the third sentence was truth. And I listened to him for 7 years. And whatever he uttered was to me truth. From that moment, life had a different import. It was as if he made you realize that you were in eternity. It never altered, it never grew. It was like the sun that you will never forget once you have seen. His presence, you see, was dynamic. You cannot pass that power on unless you have it. And so that was the sheer power of his personality. And so we can see through his various writings, through his various talks, his various speeches, how he was constantly in tune with a restless speaker, with a restless spirit that came out as an inevitable expression with great power. It is often related how at the art museum in Chicago, when he gave his speech there to all the delegates there, 7,000 people, 3,000 seated, the rest standing, was packed. If you go to Chicago, you can see that hall today, much modified, no doubt. And the stage on which he spoke, the direction has been reversed somehow, but the hall is the same. And what made such an enthusiastic reception from 7,000 people, we are told, was the fact that all he said was, "Sisters and brothers of America." Immediately you have a universal message. No distinction of caste, no distinction of creed, no distinction of culture, just the fact that all of us are entitled to access our own freedom. He says the only religion I teach is the religion of mukti, freedom. He says so many things. He says we must plunge heart and soul and body into the work until we are ready, or we be ready to sacrifice everything else to one idea and to one alone. We never will see the light unless we do that. Those that want to help mankind, he says, must take their own pleasure and pain, name and fame, and all sorts of interests, make a bundle of them, and throw them into the sea, and then come to the Lord. This is what all masters said and did. And all masters means for everyone. So you can see he's come not as a speaker, not as an orator, but as a messenger. Now, interesting enough, what we call prophet means messenger. What was his message? He's come to deliver the message of universal spirituality. How is it a timely thing? Well, you cannot have a cause and effect which are separate and different. And if we go back, why was Swami Vivekananda so powerful? Because there was a Ramakrishna. Why was there Ramakrishna? Because there was an inspired woman who had a vision and built a temple. And you can trace all these sequences of events way back. You can see it's like a wave beginning and rising and surging and having its great impact. This was how Swami Vivekananda described these great personalities of prophets and of incarnations and so on as huge waves that come to sweeping humanity and humanity's interest for thousands and thousands of years. And so he teaches in a way that is captivating and interesting, not because he was a born gifted orator, but because he had a message. And the message came from an inner attunement, an alignment with the spirit that came out immediately. And it was like a fire that caught the imagination and the spirit, the equally resonating spirit of the listener. Not only that, but inspired people like Josephine MacLeod in such a way that it changed her life forever. Imagine. So he says in one of his lectures that I just quoted, he goes on telling story after story from the Chandogya Upanishad. And then he says, you remember that the Vedas have two parts, ceremonial and the knowledge. In other words, he's teaching his message in the framework of the Vedas. that is anta, the end, the finality of the Vedas, Vedanta. And that was his message, not to do with personalities. When we have Vedanta societies all over the world, that is what we should be teaching, is this universal philosophy. Particularly today, where there is a seeming conflict between, particularly in Europe and in America and places like this, where the religious fervor that used to be there, let us say a few hundred years ago, is no longer there. Why? The world has changed. And science now, the reasoning aspect of science is taking the fore, and people are noticing there are some things within science that are not so reasonable. There are some things within modern science that are purely metaphysical and simply grounded in a doctrine. There can be no external cause. But we in Vedanta agree there can be no external cause. It is inside you. It is purely internal. He says, he says there are two principles, goes on in that same lecture, and he says the one principle is that science tells us very, very firmly, he's talking about the 19th century, that any cause must be inherent within itself. In other words, he gives the example of this Isaac Newton, his kind of discovery, we call it that for the time being, of gravity. It's not a discovery, everybody has discovered it. But what is it? Now, if one apple fell and no other apple fell, then we would have to question what is the force behind it. And you might say, well, one apple fell, maybe there's a ghost in a tree or an angel or something that threw the apple. That's an external cause. No. One apple fell, all apples fell, and you apply that principle universally in a generalized way and say there's something called a universal principle, gravity. That's how you discover it. And it is inherent, it's an inherent quality within something, not outside something. And so when religion comes to the point of a creator God, an extra cosmic creator God, he points out that's all well and good, but it's not the end, because it cannot be outside. It has to be inside. In pointing these things out amongst religious leaders as well, there's a clear distinction between the religion that he describes as doctrines, dogmas, books, temples, churches, and so on and so forth in different ways, and the higher universal truth that each soul is potentially divine. And it doesn't matter if you're in America, it doesn't matter if you're in London, it doesn't matter if you are in India or whatever it is. He also points out the impact that is there in terms of East and West views, in terms of, for example, the profound philosophy of Vedanta, which espouses a complete universality, but he says in India we haven't got the strength. What we need the fraternal feeling, the universal feeling, and he points this out of Islam. Islam in India, we think maybe Islam is a threat in many different parts of the world, but he's saying we need this aspect of Islam, and we need this philosophy of Hinduism, because to make it truly practically universal, we have to consider humanity as brothers and sisters, a fundamental principle of Islam. Now, who is he talking to? Well, he's talking to people in India. And when he talks about these Western philosophies, when he's talking about the rationale, when he's talking about the universal principle of the oneness, he's talking to everybody. And he's talking to people in the Western framework in language that they would understand. Not only is he talking, but he's trying to experience Western culture as well. He's immersing himself there, just as he's encouraging those who worked in India from the West, and Sister Nivedita and others. Please be Indian, dress like an Indian, put saris on, learn the language, adopt the customs, immerse yourself. If you don't do that, how will you understand the people that you're trying to assist in uplifting? Similarly, if you're coming from one particular culture and going into another, in order to deliver your great message, what will you need to do? You'll need to understand the psyche. You'll need to understand the cultural aspect of the people you're visiting. You'll need to be teaching in the language they understand. And I was told very clearly that the founder of the French Center in Gretz, Swami Siddheswarananda, made a remark. He said, I don't teach people Bhakti Yoga. I teach people Jnana Yoga. Why? Because it's a Roman Catholic, basically a Roman Catholic culturally, a Roman Catholic country. They have enough of that. They have so much ritual, so much devotion in their spirituality. But what we need to do is we need to teach them the universal principle, which applies to everybody, and it has to be completely rational. It has to be compatible with modern science. And it has to be a universal message that everybody understands, that is all-inclusive. And so this was Swami Vivekananda's approach as well. He says, in the world, take always the position of the giver. Give everything and look for no return. Give love, give help, give service, give any little thing you can, but keep out barter. Make no conditions, and none will be imposed. Let us give out of our own bounty, just as God gives to us. Give as the rose gives perfume, because it is its own nature, utterly unconscious of giving. This is coming from somebody who has an expansive heart, beautiful heart. And we think of Swami Vivekananda as this jnani, but inside is this bhakti, such a sensitive soul. We see when he goes back and his own brother monks are resisting his insight into Ramakrishna's universal message. And they're fighting with him, leading him to the frustration of giving way to tears, begging them. When he asked Swami Turiyananda, please come to the West, come to America. Turiyananda said, whose inner nature really, whose fundamental nature is very, very insular. He left to himself, he would sit and meditate the whole day after day, month after month. You're a real yogi. And Vivekananda is appealing from the heart. He says, look, won't you do something for me? I'm giving everything. I'm giving my heart, my body, everything I'm giving to the point of exhaustion. Won't you do this little thing? Oh, he immediately agrees. And Swami Turiyananda and Sister Nivedita and Swami Vivekananda set off for their second visit to the West. People think, well, this is good for him because his health is failing. And Sister Nivedita needs to raise money. And he needs to put somebody, a reliable person in the West, Swami Turiyananda, who is saying, I have taught people, you see, they have seen the warrior, that is himself, the strength, that kind of attitude, the manliness. Now I'm sending them a Brahmin, somebody who is living the life in a way that is close to Brahman, put it that way. So he has a whole scheme, a whole plan. When he goes back to India, he outlines, for the first time, he outlines his plan of campaign, like a kind of strategist. His whole plan he lays out. And we have to remember his young age. He doesn't reach the age of 40 even before he expires completely, having given himself heart, soul, mind, everything, physically, mentally, in every way, for this one mission, for this one message, this universal message, this harmonizing message of the oneness of humanity, not just in general as a humanity, that's fine, but going a step further, the spiritual oneness which we find in all. And so, just to review a number of other things, how he looked. He was a person, an Indian called Mr. Desai, who attended Swamiji's first public lecture in London, and he recalls this. That was the first time I saw the commanding figure of the great Swami. In other words, he had a commanding figure. He was not so tall, but he had a commanding presence. You can see that. The impact of his eyes, the impact of his stance. So he looked more like an Indian prince, was his assessment, than a sadhu or holy man. He had a Bhagavad Putka, an ochre-colored turban on his head. He electrified the audience by his grand and powerful oratory. I want you to pause and think about that. Electrifying an audience, you know. And then the next day, the report appeared in the papers that he was the next Indian after Keshav Chandra Sen, who was well educated and who had surprised the English audience by his own magnificent oratory. And he spoke on the Vedanta, that is Swami Vivekananda. His large eyes, he says, were rolling like anything, and there was such an animation about him that it passes description. After the meeting was over, the Swami took off his turban and put on a huge deep Kashmiri cap, looking like a Persian hat. Now he had a remarkable sense of humor, Swami Vivekananda, and he would wear a number of hats like that just for fun. One moment was he was passing a mirror in a hall, and he was the devotee watching this, because he went, looked at the mirror and walked away, pacing up and down, and every time he saw the mirror, he paused and looked. And the devotee wonders, oh, this must be vanity. And then he says, you know, it's remarkable. Every time I look in the mirror and walk away, I forget how I look. I have to go and see again. In other words, he had no awareness of his physical appearance at all. And you can see in his various photographs how he posed in different ways. So, you see, it was very difficult to get Sri Ramakrishna to pose. He did it once at a photographic studio. It is one of my most favorite pictures, really, of Sri Ramakrishna, because his eyes are open and he's standing there posed with his unique gesture in his hand like that. But you see, where does Swami Vivekananda's power come from? It comes only from Sri Ramakrishna. That's it. Sri Ramakrishna's spirit, if you will, working through the Swami. Ramakrishna's message was absolutely universal. He had the practical application of being aligned to the divinity in all different poses, in all different ways, with all different approaches, with an experimental mindset that says, let me find out using the laboratory of my own mind and see what is the truth about what is being said. And what was his discovery? Harmony of religions, that every road he took led to the same realization. And the highest realizations, Totapuri taught him this nirvikalpa samadhi, this non-dualistic approach, not just the principle of it. And Swami Vivekananda, as Narendra, resisted it. He made fun of it. You mean this cup is God? You mean this table is God? Poking fun. And of course, one day, Ramakrishna said, please read me this wonderful text. I think it was the Ashtavakra Gita. Please read this out for me. Oh, no, I don't believe in all this non-dualism thing. No, just for my sake, said Ramakrishna, you read it for me, please. And he read it. And then, of course, he got the experience of non-dualism, that he saw this divinity in every cup, in every plate, in the floor, in the chair, everywhere. He had this actual experience because of this contact with this modern rishi that was Ramakrishna. And so this is really a few thoughts, a few ideas. We could go on, of course, for a long time on the subject of Vivekananda. I have a book here, Vivekananda Biography, and as usual, I'll pick anything up at random and see where we go with it just to finalize this talk. So, the idea that his years were numbered, this is, of course, every chapter is well delineated. This is experiences in the West, section like that. The idea that his years were numbered came to Swami Vivekananda again and again. He would often say at this time, "Oh, the body is a terrible bondage," or "How I wish that I could hide myself forever." The notebook that he had carried during his wanderings in India contained these significant words: "Now, to seek a corner and lay myself down to die." In a letter to a friend, he quoted these words and said, "Yet all this karma remained. I hope I have now worked it out. It appears like a hallucination that I was in these childish dreams of doing this, doing that. I am getting out of them. Perhaps these mad desires were necessary to bring me over to this country, that is America, and I thank the Lord for the experience." And then on March 25th, 1896, he delivered his famous lecture on the philosophy of Vedanta before the graduate students of the philosophy department of Harvard University, that level. He produced such an impression that he was offered the chair of Eastern philosophy in the university, it's Harvard. Later, a similar offer came from Columbia University also, but he declined both on the ground that he was a sannyasin. Now we have to understand, of course, that in his wandering days as a monk, he was formulating his mission. And his mission was very clear, but ultimately, crystal clear, ultimately. But it was very vague in the beginning. He knew there was something that had to be done, and his experience of a wandering monk clinched it, because he saw the suffering and the difficulties. Again, we see not Vivekananda as an intellectual, but Vivekananda as a compassionate being whose heart bled for the poor, and his emotional attachment for his hinterland, for his precious India, was never lost. And in that, then we find a saving moment. We find not only was he preaching this universal message, but he was also liberating India, liberating her from her enslavement. You know, any colonial power that goes and conquers and occupies a country doesn't do it for the good of the country or the people. They're doing it for their own wealth. And that is how the British Empire, we have to frankly say, was working. And yet portraying a useful, harmonious overlord that was establishing some level of stability in a country and so on and so forth under that guise. They did it everywhere, of course, and every colonial power does it. The Roman Empire also did it, and so on. We can say Roman Empire produced many roads and aqueducts, and so yes, that's true. But what did they also do? They enslaved people. In order to enrich Rome, same thing. Any conqueror will have that understanding, and the conquered people may not exactly have it. So what happened in 50 years or so after the great wave called Ramakrishna, the shackles went, the shackles left. And we cannot ignore the influence that Swami Vivekananda had on the ancient culture, the ancient heritage of India that inspired Sister Nivedita to carry on his work. I think for the first time I heard, and it was Swami Vivekananda, who was formerly in the UK, and we were opening a place in Wimbledon where associated with Sister Nivedita, there was a historical plaque there and so on, the house that she occupied. And Swami Vivekananda, whose opening icebreaker was always the same, by the way, and it was wonderful. He says, like Henry VIII, he's talking to English people, like Henry VIII, I won't keep you long. Or like Henry VIII said to his wives, I should say, I won't keep you for long. Anyway, he said, you see, Sister Nivedita was the extension of Swami Vivekananda. And really the only thing that we know intimately about Swami Vivekananda's daily presence, conversations, ideas, inspirations, really comes from the voyage that she, Swami Turiyananda, and Vivekananda make back to the West. And there, from that, she gets inspiration. The Master, as I saw him, is really the only actual biography, original biography of Swami Vivekananda. Of course, Sister Nivedita loved him so much. He was everything to her. He was father, he was mother, he was teacher, he was friend. And so when he did finally expire, when he withdrew from the body, we have to say it frankly, like a yogi, as was predicted by his master, then, of course, she sat there fanning his body for several hours, weeping uncontrollably, rolling on the ground, wishing, if only I had a piece of cloth from him. And as the funeral pyre burns, miraculously, a piece of cloth comes and lands on her lap. She took his message, and when you hear through her writings and through the records of Sister Nivedita talking, you really do see Swami Vivekananda coming through. Her strength, her courage came from him. She already had that feistiness, individuality of nature, as he did. And while he was the lion, she was indeed the lioness. These are some thoughts on Swami Vivekananda. And where do we have? About 10 minutes to 11 now. So if you like, you can add your comments and your thoughts. We have one thing that I didn't read out, and that was, for me, it is focus and coherence as well as determination. Absolutely correct. Yes. Wonderful.
I suppose my question is, when I hear you talk about Vivekananda, and then I think about all of the descendants to our modern day Swamis, this universal message, I feel, is such a powerful universal message that it can only really be delivered by a Swami. And therefore, my question is, how do we communicate that message? And I understand in our meditation, in our daily lives, but in conversation, how do we discuss that beautiful universal message without confrontation, without judgment, without trying to differentiate from any other system or any other belief?
Well, firstly, this universal message is told by every great teacher, and the outstanding ones that we know, these best of the great waves that came. We find this universal message in the Bhagavad Gita. We find this message in the teachings of the sages in the Upanishads. And when you say only by a Swami, I would have to say not at all. It's a universal message that everybody, when they understand it, can convey. I was going to say teach, but we're not, we have no right to teach anybody as such, in a sense. And the way in which we can influence others to truly understand the salvific message of a universal approach and a universal truth is to live it without any words. See, my own guru, Swami Vivekananda, was a person of very few words. Now, he did give talks, he did give writings, he was a great scholar too, and he was a very efficient administrator and all these other things. But of course, his sanctity was self-evident. And I remember sitting with him, and for a long, long time, with what we might call, if you didn't understand it, an awkward pause. Nobody's talking. He's simply sitting. And people are there sitting with him, and they're quite happy to bathe in his presence, as it were. No necessity to talk, or convey that. See, the powerful presence of a Ramakrishna or a Jesus didn't require any talking necessarily. Now, Ramakrishna taught a lot. He conversed a lot. We can see the complete record, well, not exactly complete, but as far as we have it in what is now the Gospel of Ramakrishna, we have these wonderful, wonderful conversations going on. And what we notice is the universal message coming through as a sense of humor and as a flexibility to adapt the message to the person that is being spoken, doing it politely, even the bluntest of things he's saying with a twinkle in his eye. And when you read some of the things, you say, whoa, that was pretty direct, But nobody's taking offense. So we should never disturb what people have at the moment. And the Bhagavad Gita tells us that as well. If people who are rajasic, people who are tamasic, try and raise them up to a level of, come on, let's do something, even if it's egoistic activity. But those kind of people, how do you move them toward a sattvic understanding? Only through example, and that's how parents teach children. The most powerful way of teaching anybody is by example. So be the example, be the light, and beam, that's it. Beam with love. Now, what if you get into a conversation and see people ask you a question, oh, Vedanta, what is that? That's a little different. You have to have an answer that comes from not only your teaching, but also from your own heart, your own experience. So, what is Vedanta? Well, it's a technical term. When I first named our society, Era Vedanta Society, Era everybody understands. That's fine. That's common to people in Ireland. Vedanta, that requires explanation. Society, people know what it is. So what is this Vedanta? It is the universal message, universal truth underlying everything. And I always manage to quote, each soul is potentially divine. And the goal is to manifest this from within. Now, each one of these statements can be challenged. So if you want some further explanation of it, then that's okay. You use logic, you use reasoning. Swami Vivekananda was living in an age where there was a great deal, and is today still, a great deal of skepticism based on the understanding that science and reason is completely opposed to religion. And it depends what you mean. If you mean blind faith, yes, agreed. But today, as I pointed out earlier, much of science, particularly theoretical science, cosmology, physics, and so on, is purely based on metaphysical speculation. It's just a philosophical approach. It's just as much blind faith as any other thing. And sometimes we have to wake up and understand that. So I did begin by saying about the scientific approach in religion, and Vivekananda himself is keen to point this out, that you take a credible authority somewhere. Let us take a Ramakrishna, let's take a Jesus, let's take a Buddha, let's take, and so on. You can take these wonderful examples and say, and every major religion will have an abundance of people who have seen directly, and we call them mystics and we call them saints and what have you. These would be our credible authorities. Now we take these credible authorities and we test it out, because the credible authority not only states there is a God, there is a soul, but also says, now if you want the same experience, here's the manual, like a car manual. Here's how it operates. A, B, C, D. Point 1, point 2, go through the process. Like assembling something from IKEA. As long as you know Swedish, you're okay. But the diagrams will tell you, okay, here you start off here, next you go there, next you go there. Make your experimentation, in other words. And then the only evidence really is direct experience. The peculiarity about direct experience is it is direct and personal. Nobody else can have it. Nobody else can have the same experience unless they follow the same process. Now, the difficulty is, do you want to do it? Suppose that somebody is entrenched in their religious belief to the point of evangelization. Very often, the only way that we can help people to be a little bit more reasonable, if we have a desire to do that, would be to ask them questions, starting off with a useful phrase. That's interesting. Why do you say that? And if the answer is because the Bible says it, or because this person says it, that person says it, or a Swami says it, then you say, well, that's not really a very good reason, actually. So it makes religion a science of religion. It's a phrase you don't often hear today. Now, it's the same in science as well. Oh, there's this cosmological theory, that's fine. It's a theory, okay, but you've put it in textbooks as a fact. So can you tell me why? Can you tell me what are the problems with it? Can you tell me how you solve the problems? And by the time they finished, you realize this is actually metaphysics. It's just philosophy. It's just an approach. It's just a suggestion. There's no actual fact behind it, and there's no experimentation behind it, even though you would like to experiment with it. So some examples of that in modern science is told about cosmology would be the multiverse. You can never prove it. Another thing in fundamental physics, let's say quantum physics, would be the idea of many worlds. It's an interpretation. And because it's people who put it forward through modern media as a kind of established fact. What are the most fundamental things? String theory. There's another thing. Okay. Well, it's a nice idea, wonderful idea, but where's your evidence for it? At the moment, it's just metaphysics. It's just a suggestion. Maybe a promissory note, we'll crack it in the future, but it never happens, and so on. So there are many things that are questionable, and if you want to have a kind of adventurous understanding of life, you have to have the same skepticism that Swami Vivekananda had. Test out these ideas. Come on. Why do you have these ideas? One encounter that Swami Vivekananda has was with the great engineering person, Ingersoll. The Ingersoll Rand compressors are well known, and mechanical equipment. He was a thoroughgoing atheist. The problem, I'm paraphrasing, the problem with you spiritual people is you don't know how to enjoy life. And Vivekananda promptly replies, on the contrary, I know how to squeeze every part of the juice of the orange of life. In other words, take life, tune your enjoyment to the present moment. Don't bypass it. Don't wait for some external stimulus to enjoy you, to promote your enjoyment. No, you find enjoyment in every moment of life because you're tuned into the glory of the divine every moment. He didn't go on to say that, but I would be saying that. There's just to finish off just with another quotation. The little separate self must die. Then we shall find that we are in the real, and that reality is God. And He is our own true nature, and He is always in us and with us. Let us live in Him and stand in Him. It is the only joyful state of existence. Life on the plane of the spirit is the only life. Let us all try to attain to this realization. And I think that's a wonderful statement to complete this morning session. And so, yes, well, it's past 11 now. It's 5 minutes past 11. We'll leave it there. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace beyond the hour. And it is worthwhile, before we finally finish off, picking up the great understanding of the Swami Vivekananda. Just to give you one more thought, when I first came across this Vedanta philosophy, yoga and all the rest of it, I never knew anything about any of these personalities. And the monk that I first encountered, Swami Nisrasananda, a disciple of a disciple of Ramakrishna, namely Mahapurush Maharaj or Swami Shivananda, and he never mentioned Ramakrishna at all. He did mention Swami Vivekananda because he had wonderfully painted a portrait and showed me the portrait that was hanging on the wall of the. Yes, he only stayed in devotees' houses, you see. And one devotee's house in Salisbury, as it was then, I went, I had a cup of tea with Swami, trying to find out more. And we had a wonderful conversation. I told him I was already practicing yoga exercise, and he invited me to go along to some yoga groups that he typically went to have a small talk. And then, of course, every Tuesday evening he had these talks again in somebody else's house. So I was aware of a presence of Swami Vivekananda. But I had no idea about Ramakrishna. And when we were sitting where he gave his talks, there was a picture of this person seated. It was Ramakrishna. And I never inquired about it, nor was he ever mentioned, interestingly enough. And so the whole of the impetus, really, the foundation for the movement of Ramakrishna's universal message and his personality that comes through this message, this all comes really through Vivekananda. Without Vivekananda, we don't have anything like that. I often think that Jesus' message was going nowhere without a St. Paul. And St. Paul spread this in a universal way, elevating this message of Jesus from the context of a small Jewish sect to a universal philosophy that everybody embraced very quickly after some 300 years or so. It took that amount of time, but small, bit by bit it grows. And the message of Vedanta has grown much more rapidly than that, actually. And it doesn't matter whether it's coming from the Ramakrishna order or the Ramakrishna mission or through the Divine Life Society or any other means. But there are plenty of modern savants who are spreading this message in a comprehensive way as well. And many of them with aligning it with modern science in an explanatory way, explaining, for example, consciousness and things like that. But anyway, I've kind of rambled on a little bit, but I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer to you. But we are not in the mode of converting people. Convert yourself first, and then see what happens. All right, you leave it at that. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, 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 you all.
Thank you, Swamiji.
Thank you, Swamiji.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Swamiji.
Thank you, Swamiji.
Thank you, Swamiji.